Welcome inside to the Alex Garrett Podcast Network, and today we have Richard V. Battle, as promised, returning to discuss more about his book, Made in America by AmeriCANS, not AmeriCANS. And Richard, thanks for joining this podcast once again. And to start out, a really, really horrible note on the loss of life with the Titan sub. Your thoughts, Mr. Battle, Richard, as we memorialize 5 humans that lost their life trying to get to the remains of the Titanic this week.
Well, thank you for having us with you again, Alex. And yes, and as a parent who lost my first and only son, I grieve with the families for those people that were lost, regardless of the age. It's never easy, and especially when it's an unexpected loss, it just is devastating. And I hoist them up in prayer and pray that they will grab God's leg and hold on to it and help them as they continue their walks going forward, because it's a tough day.
You know, there are a lot of people this week that have been saying, oh, well, they're rich, they kind of deserve to die. I mean, what a horrible thing to think and even say out loud. But the can-do spirit, talk about that for a second.
Well, absolutely. No one deserves this type of catastrophic loss, and that's one of the points. I've even got a later book that Made in America by AmeriCANS, not AmeriCANS, called The Unopened Present. And it's just because somebody has something you don't have doesn't mean that they're rich. And even if they are rich, doesn't mean that we should be jealous or envious of what they have, because that enmity and creates anger, and it inhibits us from our personal growth. And we have to accept where people are and just look at how we can improve ourselves. And the only competition we should really have is becoming better than the person we were yesterday.
Well, you know, we talk about the high seas here and the tragedy that this part of the Atlantic Ocean has wrought on not only the Titanic families, but generations after, and now the Titan subfamilies. But I want to get into your 7 C's, not the 7 SCAS, but your 7 C's to success and towards having that can-do attitude as AmeriCANS.
Well, absolutely. And in Made in America by AmeriCANS, not AmeriCANS, I have a collection of essays, and this one is about how we can achieve Tom Brady type performance in any part of our life. And so I came up with these C's, and then there's an alternative definition that we can use as well, because if someone just uses this as a template and recognizes that they first have to make a choice, which is basically a vision. Where do they want to go? And then second, a chance is taking a risk. There's no growth. There's no extra success without taking a risk. And then change. That requires action. And too often people don't want to change, and they don't act, and so you don't get any improved behavior. And then we want to channel that in energy, which is focus. And the analogy I like to use is, think of blowing up a balloon and letting it go in a room, and it will fly all around the room and then expend itself on the floor. And blow up that same balloon and put it on a track that'll run in a straight line, and that balloon will run a long way down a straight line. Both balloons had the same energy, but the balloon that had the straight line encompassing the things we just talked about will have a much greater performance than the one that just flies around the room before it falls. I'll stop there so in case you want to talk about those before we finish up on them.
The balloon analogy is very interesting, because I also believe, Richard V. Battle, that every choice we make, and that's one of your 7 C's, every choice we make does change the trajectory of our day, like the wind changes the trajectory of the balloon. Would you agree?
Well, yes, and I believe there's no positive growth with a negative attitude. And so we have to have a positive attitude, and all of these encompass having a positive attitude when we begin. And after channeling, we talk about the commitment, and that's dedication. And dedication is basically the commitment to finish what you committed to long after the enthusiasm in which you made it expires. And we've all known a lot of people who will commit to do something, but then all of a sudden they get into the hard part of it and they decide it's not worth pursuing. And the people who are the most successful dedicate themselves to finishing what they commit to, regardless of how much that enthusiasm's left them. And then consistently as being persistent. And Calvin Coolidge had the best quote about persistence is the essential thing, and that education's not. There's a lot of educated derelicts, and talent's not. There's a lot of people that have talent but never use it. But persistence alone is omnipotent. And then when I talked about coming again, and that's basically showing up every day, day in, day out. And too often people will again not show up every day and think that they can work occasionally and have great results. And life doesn't do that. I don't care what your goal is, what you're trying to do. To successfully achieve the highest heights, you have to perform these functions consistently.
Well, Richard, I know you don't like to get that political, but because you do have political experience, you've been part of Governor Perry's council down in Texas when he was governor. I got to ask you about this persistence in the presidential race for 2024. Both men, President Biden and former President Trump, are in legal trouble, yet they keep on running. What a sign of persistence, right?
Well, I think you're right, and there's no partisanship on these qualities of leadership and how you can be successful. Anybody, regardless of which side of the aisle they're on, can apply them in their lives. And I think we have a history, and that's part of the reason I wrote Made in America by AmeriCANS, not AmeriCANS. Our forebears had that can-do spirit. And we are being told by people in government, media, and other places today that we as individuals can't do things. And we may or may not be able to do everything, but we all can do more than we are doing most of the time. And that's what our forebears did. They had the courage and took these risks and made the changes to accomplish building this great country. And it wasn't a partisan action. It was individuals over the 200 plus years of our country. And they gave us this great gift of liberty. And we owe it to our children and grandchildren to broaden our shoulders and toughen up and continue so we can give them that gift of liberty and even more when it's their generation's time to stand up.
And I've always said, Richard, the generation now is in the bullpen for when leaders like President Trump and, yes, President Biden can no longer run the country. And I don't feel like we're ready for this generation. So thank you for this book to continue preserving a legacy. Now, the 7 C's have also been a big deal for me in my pursuit to get this podcast on radio. So thank you for inspiring me, Richard.
I didn't invent any of these. I just kind of scrambled the eggs and put them together in this sequence to try to make it easy to communicate. Because a lot of times people want to do things and they may get 6 of the 7, and the 7th one may be the missing ingredient, and it's like baking a cake and you miss the one important ingredient, the cake doesn't taste the same. And so putting the 7 of them together in your actions, I think, will significantly increase the probability of success.
You have a whole chapter dedicated to the post-COVID world, and in these 7 C's you mentioned establishing higher goals. And I feel like this pandemic and the aftermath is that not many people are willing to set higher goals anymore because, well, hey, we just kind of all got used to working from home, and those that got used to it don't want to go back. So how do we reestablish those higher goals again post-COVID in 2023?
Well, yes, and there was a lot of difference depending on what part of the country you were in. And I know up in the New York area, y'all were shut down much longer than we were in Texas. But in any adverse situation, and the pandemic was one, I think, and I talked about previously, we have two choices. One, we can hunker down and wait for it to blow over. Or two, we can look for opportunities in that adversity that may have arisen but are different than what our original goals were. My goal at the time of the pandemic, I was wanting to do much more of public speaking, corporate and for associations and things of that type nature. And the pandemic shut all that down. And so I turned to doing more radio and TV and podcasts like this, and now do about 200 a year that I never dreamed I would do because I chose a different path versus just sitting down and not doing anything.
Richard, you do make a lot of weekly appearances on different places. So what is your goal in not only preserving history through these books, but also as you write books like AmeriCANS versus AmeriCANS, Made in America by Americans and AmeriCANS?
Well, I think that's a great question. And one of the things I tell people is even if no one reads or hears what I'm saying except my daughter and her future children, and it helps their lives, that will be an achievement. But I hope that people listening or reading my books will get something out of them that can help them in their lives. And I believe if we can touch enough people, your podcast, my efforts, and others as well, if we can touch people and help them improve their lives, they will be more satisfied, but they will also contribute to building a better country for the future, and that's one of my objectives.
Talk about the real-life application of the words you've written in this book, because obviously when you get immersed in the book, you don't think of the real-life applications, but that is a goal as well, to make it applicable in real life.
Well, yes, and I think these 7 C's can apply to your personal goals, whether it be physical, spiritual, professional, financial, social, whatever goals you come up with. I think it can apply in a family, in business, in civic activities. Whatever you're doing, I think you can apply them, and that's what makes them so nice. They're brief, they're concise, and they're clear, and someone can pick them up and apply them today and take where they're at today, wherever that is, and make tomorrow a better day than today, and the day after tomorrow an even better day.
A little while ago, you referenced future projects that you're working on right now. Tell us, what can we expect from Richard V. Battle in the coming future here?
Well, I just published my latest book called The Unopened Present. And when my son was 6 months old, I was an older father, and I was concerned that I might pass before I could teach him the essential truths or principles of life. And so I wrote him a letter and had 43 important life lessons in it. And unfortunately, he passed away 3 months later. And I put that as an appendix in a book I wrote about that grief, surviving grief by God's grace, 20 years ago. And last year when I was doing radio about Father's Day and talking about that loss and overcoming the grief, I'd had someone in Texas overhear my talking on a radio interview, and they called me, and this story's in the Unopened Present. I'm abridging it right now, and basically said that they had prayed the night before that God would send someone to say words that could help them because he had lost his daughter 2 months before. And I had mentioned that to a friend, and the friend said, between that story and these lessons, you should write a book about that. And so I took those 43 principles, expanded and commented on them, added examples, quotes, scriptural references, and that's what's in the Unopened Present, in the hope that young parents, children, grandparents for their children and grandchildren, people leading groups can look at those principles and that information and help them be more successful.
Richard, we've had a great conversation, and then you just mentioned about being a successful society. So tell me about how we as Americans can be AmeriCANS and get involved politically, but, not storming the Capitol or causing any kind of damage, just really changing our country for the better, is it just the ballot box? Or is it also keeping an eye on the legal system, which we, as I mentioned, see President Biden and Hunter Biden and President Trump in trouble in right now?
Citizenship rights are like a muscle. If we don't exercise them, they'll atrophy. And I believe that we should have principle over power and honor over ambition. And one of the diseases, and it's bipartisan, that we have right now is we have ensconced political leaders who make a career out of holding political office. And they treat us like rulers treat subjects as opposed to how elected servants treat citizens. And if we had term limits or if we have turnover of leadership, that will breathe fresh air into it. We have to hold those leaders accountable, and we have to restrict their ambition and their seeking power. And that's what our founders did so brilliantly, again, was having checks and balances and limited power. It made it to where people knew they couldn't do too much and it wasn't rewarding to be in government, so they would go serve for a year or two and then go back home. And we've made it too enticing to be in government full time. It's like an industry now, whereas before it was a public service that citizens rendered. And we were a much healthier country when it was a citizens volunteer effort for their community, state, or nation than we are now with a political class.
Well, I'm going to have to digest this again listening back to this podcast because that's a lot of insight. Tell us a couple of real-life stories of amputees who are also athletes.
Well, one in Made in America by AmeriCANS, not AmeriCANS, was Chris Koch. And he was born without arms and legs. And his parents treated him like the rest of the children. And so when he decided he wanted to do something, they would help him try to accomplish it. And he's done marathons, he's played sports, and he's done so many different accomplishments because he refused to think that he could not do it. And my dad, when I used to complain to him about not being able to do something, I'd say, I can't do it. And my dad would always say, can't never did anything. And can he or can we do everything? No. But if we don't try, if we don't push ourselves to the very limits and then fail at some point, we'll never reach the heights we can reach. And too often we accept less than our best because we don't want to reach that final step where we can't do it.
Well, I think we can all use a little improvement, and that's why I recommend Made in America by AmeriCANS, not AmeriCANS, by Richard Battle. Richard, we can all use improvement, right?
Oh, absolutely. And to me, Chris Koch inspires me. You inspire me. You do so much. Nick Vujicic, who's a evangelist who was born with no arms and no legs. He's very similar. Jen Bricker is another one I wrote about. She was born without legs, and she played high school softball and basketball, and her dream was to become an acrobat and an aerialist, which she has done professionally. And again, her parents told her the one word she could never say was can't. And too often we as parents or friends or supervisors or whatever, we help enable people to say can't when we should always encourage people, well, hey, give it a try. If you fall short, let's find out what you can do and let's do as much as you can do and always try to do more.
All right, I got to ask you this. What happens when the government tells us we can't? What should we do?
Well, that's a great question. And first thing is, I think that they promote us letting them do it. They tell us, just trust us, we'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. Just go enjoy your life. And one great example was a guy named Joe Robbie some years ago. He owned the Miami Dolphins. And when he wanted a new stadium and to get out of the old Orange Bowl, he went to the government for building permits and things of that nature, and he was going to do it on his own, and the government told him he couldn't do it. And he took that as a personal challenge and said, watch me. And he ended up building his own stadium on the borderline between Broward and Dade County down there for the Miami Dolphins. And he did it despite the government to show people what could be done. And too often we sit back and just accept what we're told on that. We don't have to riot or protest or do other types of things. A lot of times there's other alternatives if we step back, think about them, look for allies, put together a plan, and then try to make something happen. Now, does that apply to everything like defending our country against external attack? Probably not. But there are a lot of things we as individuals and groups of people can and used to do instead of the government doing everything.
Well, I got to say thank you for writing in my personal copy, Keep Up the Can-Do Spirit. And I've got a question. How many people reading this book have told you they're getting inspired to have that can-do spirit thanks to you?
I have a lot of people say, hey, that inspired me to do something I didn't think I could do. And so I do get that a lot. But people are frustrated and they think, I can't do everything I want to do. And so my word of encouragement to everyone is, none of us can do everything. All of us can do one thing. So pick one area that you want to work on or you want to contribute to your community, state, or nation. Pick that one area and get involved in that one area and help. And what you will find is once you start helping and make a little bit of a difference, it will inspire you to do more. And when you're inspired to do more, you'll contribute more. And if enough of us do that in different areas of life, we will all contribute to a much better country.
And for those listening that might want to reach out to you, Richard, what's the best email or point of contact for you?
Well, thank you for asking. My email is richard@richardbattle.com. richardbattle.com, BATTLE, is the website, and all books ordered on that website are signed. And if you'd like one inscribed, you can email me, and we have a lot of people buying my books for gifts, for graduation, Father's Day, and other things, and I'm happy to inscribe them to people to try to inspire them, similar to what you said, and that means a lot to me when my words meant something to you.
Made in America by AmeriCANS, not AmeriCANS, by Richard V. Battle. Follow him on Twitter as well, Richard V. Battle. And yes, Richard, I can't wait to have you back on in a couple of weeks. We're going to drop your Amazon link as well for people to buy a copy of this book. Thanks for joining us today on the Alex Garrett Podcast Network.